By the early 1700s, the 13 American colonies were prosperous, integrated hubs of the British Empire. They traded local cash crops for manufactured goods across the Atlantic, operating as wealthy, loyal subjects to the crown. But running a global empire carried a massive price tag. The French and Indian War had recently secured Britain's borders in North America, but it left the British Parliament holding an enormous war debt. To cover the shortfall, London looked to the colonies to pay the bill. This image shows the red 1-penny tax stamps from 1765. Parliament required colonists to purchase these for every legal document, newspaper, and pamphlet. Because the colonists had no elected representatives in Parliament to consent to these levies, they viewed this direct taxation as an illegal overreach of power. What began as political frustration and localized boycotts quickly collapsed into physical violence. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd in Massachusetts, killing 5 civilians. 3 years later, protesters dumped a massive shipment of British tea into Boston Harbor. Britain retaliated by closing Boston's port and stripping Massachusetts of its right to self-government. These strict penal measures dissolved the long-standing illusion of a mutually beneficial empire. Across the 13 colonies, a new identity took hold as people realized they were living under occupation, not a partnership. In April 1775, the standoff turned into a war. British regulars marched out of Boston toward the towns of Lexington and Concord, operating under orders to violently seize colonial weapon caches. Local militias stood in their path. A single musket shot, fired by an unknown hand, instantly transformed an ideological dispute into an active rebellion. This diagram shows the scale of the challenge. The colonists were fielding fragmented local militias with almost no heavy artillery or naval support. They were attempting to outfight the wealthiest, best-trained military machine on the planet. By firing on the king's troops, the militias crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The conflict shifted from a diplomatic dispute to a battle for physical survival. To organize this chaos, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington to lead the Continental Army. His task was to professionalize the leadership and turn under-equipped volunteers into a force capable of surviving a collision with British regulars. While Washington trained the army, the public required a framework to justify total independence. In early 1776, Thomas Paine published this pamphlet, Common Sense. It stripped away the idea of reconciling with the king and presented a clear argument for a total break from the crown. That summer in Philadelphia, Congress took the ultimate political step. Thomas Jefferson drafted a formal document declaring that all men possessed unalienable rights and that the colonies were dissolving all political ties to Great Britain. This image focuses on the signatures at the bottom of the Declaration of Independence. Under British law, every man who signed this parchment was committing high treason, an offense punishable by death. On July 4, 1776, 56 men signed a collective death warrant, betting their lives on an improbable victory against the world's most powerful monarch. Declaring independence on paper was simple compared to the bleak reality of enforcing it. By the winter of 1777, the Continental Army had been pushed into a freezing, desperate encampment at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Washington's men were crammed into primitive log cabins like these. The soldiers lacked meat, shoes, and warm blankets. In these conditions, the lack of basic supplies killed more men than British bullets. Malnutrition and freezing temperatures allowed disease to decimate the ranks. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia killed roughly 2,000 soldiers over the course of a few months. The army survived due to the arrival of Baron von Steuben. He instituted rigorous sanitation protocols and drilled the starving men relentlessly, transforming them into a disciplined, standardized fighting force. Emerging from the logistical hell of Valley Forge, the Continental Army had transformed into a professional fighting force. They survived the winter, proving that the war was now a contest of strategic endurance. Later that year, American forces scored a victory at Saratoga. For the first time, a major British army was forced to surrender in the field. This success caught the attention of France, Britain's greatest rival. Realizing the Americans could succeed, the French injected money, modern weapons, and naval power. This map illustrates how France's entry altered the scale of the war. Britain was suddenly fighting a global conflict. forcing them to divert ships and regiments away from North America to protect their assets in the Caribbean and Europe. With British resources stretched thin across the world, foreign intervention became the necessary catalyst that made victory a mathematically possible outcome. In 1781, Washington marched combined American and French troops south to Yorktown, Virginia, boxing in British General Cornwallis against the coast. Expecting a naval evacuation, Cornwallis was trapped when a massive French fleet arrived offshore, cutting off the sea escape to create an inescapable checkmate. The disaster at Yorktown broke London's political will to continue the struggle. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally ended the conflict, with Britain officially recognizing the independence of the United States. The birth of America was a triumph of extreme risk tolerance and logistical endurance. It proved that ordinary citizens could outlast a global empire to forge an entirely new nation.